Thank you everyone for joining me for this drop-in mini session via the Levy Library. This is Introduction to Preprints. My name is Carrie Levinson. Hello. I am the Reference and Instruction Librarian at the Mount Sinai West and Morningside campuses. We have a fairly packed agenda, so I am going to just go over this very quickly and then we're going to go right into it. So first I'm going to talk about what a preprint is, the origins of preprints, why do we have them, what green open access is and why on earth I'm talking about it when I'm talking about preprints, where you can find preprints, should we be concerned about the use of preprints, and how are preprints cited in research? So the first and obvious question is, what is a preprint? And there isn't one standard definition. Essentially, a preprint is the manuscript of a research paper before peer review and acceptance from a journal. Often these manuscripts will be deposited on a repository or a preprint server in order to be freely available to everyone, but not all the time. Not all preprints end up being published, but between 44% and 77% of them do. So many preprints do end up becoming peer-reviewed published journal articles. This is an example of a preprint from the preprint server medRxiv, which we will be talking about a little bit more in a few minutes. You can see that it doesn't look like a published journal article. So there's no formatting, there are no fancy logos from the publisher. It pretty much looks like a Word document, right? Because that's what it is. These are the types of documents that you are going to see when you go to a preprint server. So there's going to be a disclaimer. So it's a little hard to see, but at the very top, there's a little disclaimer saying that this is a preprint and that it's not peer reviewed. But overall, it's just going to pretty much look like a Word document. So where did preprints come from? Preprints have actually been around for a pretty long time. So in large-scale implementation, they've been around since the early 1960s, but they've actually been around even longer than that. So there have been specific institutions like the American Chemical Society that were using preprints as early as 1921. So although a lot of people aren't aware of preprints, they're not a new concept. For this large-scale implementation that came about in 1961, this was because publication takes a really long time. So the NIH came up with a program to sort of help that, help the dissemination of research results be faster. So the average time from the first submission to publication in a traditional publication process is about 9 months, and it can be longer if you're taking into account shopping around for a journal, possibly being rejected from different journals and then finally being accepted at another one, the time for submission. All these things taken into account take a long time. So the NIH came up with a program called the Information Exchange Groups for biology preprints specifically. And it did pretty well for the time that it was around. It was only around until about 1967. There were about 3,600 participants and 2,500 documents. And it increased the informal communication between scientists who could then talk about their work in a faster way so they could disseminate these research results faster. But of course, none of these were in digital format because it was the 1960s. The first official preprint server came about in 1991, and that is a preprint server you've probably heard of. It's called Archive. It's spelled ARXIV, and that is for the physical sciences. And this is really the start of preprints as we think about them now. So these are digital versions that people have access to via the internet. And the reason that preprints have stuck around is because there are a lot of benefits. So I already mentioned that preprints allow the faster dissemination and discussion of results, but this has never been more important than right now when we're talking about COVID-19 research. And I'm going to just quickly go over to medRxiv and bioRxiv, which have a shared archive for COVID-19 research specifically. So here it is. They're both run by the Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory. And COVID-19 has not been around a whole long time, and yet there are over 5,500 articles in this. So that's incredibly impressive, but it's also really important. If we had to wait for each of these articles to be published in a peer-reviewed journal, we would never get anywhere. We wouldn't be getting the treatments and the guidance that we've needed for this global pandemic. So it really shows how important it is to have things like preprints so that people can get access to research much faster and worldwide. So it's not behind a paywall. People can access it from anywhere, and they can talk about it and build upon that work. COVID-19 has really brought that to the forefront. Preprints have other benefits as well. So authors can get feedback and revise their papers accordingly before submission to a journal. So remember that statistic I had where it said that 44 to 77% of preprints get published. So it's important to have a good paper to submit to a journal so that it can be eventually published as a peer-reviewed article. And authors can, basically preprints allow you to comment on the research within them and make suggestions. So people can get guidance on certain things. So an expert in that field can say, hey, this is a really great paper, but did you consider this? Or have you ever heard of this author? Because I think they're doing something that's very similar to what you're doing, and you should probably be citing them in your research. Or I see your results and I'm not quite understanding what the data is. Can you clarify this? So it allows the revision of manuscripts before it's submitted to a journal, and that potentially makes it more likely that that article is going to be accepted because a lot of the problems have been talked about beforehand and rectified. So it's a great way as a sort of informal kind of mentorship. In addition, preprints establish priority and can prove originality. So an argument is that, excuse me, is that posters and oral presentations at conferences already do this. And that's true. They may prove originality of ideas, but they're often not public, or they may not be detailed enough to prove an original idea. And preprints, because they're entire papers and are public, can prove this. So posting a preprint, which will give the preprint a timestamp and sometimes a DOI, shows exactly when that manuscript was posted. And so you can say, okay, I published this work on this date at this time, so that people can see when what came first. In addition, they can provide access to content that might otherwise disappear. So there are several instances where research just doesn't get published because of some sort of circumstance. So for example, if you have a graduate student who leaves a lab before a paper is done and they haven't put their final touches on it, you may not be able to publish that work, but that doesn't mean that the results from that work aren't important and don't provide value to that particular research community. So you can post that as a preprint. The same thing goes for projects that yield data that is hard to sort of put into a clear narrative, but their results are still important or still have value to other people who might be looking at them. And another example is replication. So say that you are trying to replicate the results of an earlier study, and you either are successful with that or you're not successful with that. So a journal may not think that that is original enough to be published, but it's still an important thing to know. Whether a study can be replicated or not is something that people need to know about. So that can be shared as a preprint. Authors put a lot of work into this research. So preprints offer a way of sharing it if it's not going to be able to be published in a traditional manner. And lastly, they can, excuse me, they can assist in career advancement, particularly for early career researchers. So a lack of a really big body of research can be an obstacle for grant applications or for academic advancement. But in the case of grant applications, preprints can allow a reviewer to take a look at the productivity of that particular researcher and see what's going on, what's in process. And it also can show that the supporting work that's proposed in that grant application, it can show the evidence behind that and make it more clear to the reviewer why this should be funded. The NIH actually encourages preprints in grant applications and reports. So they're already totally on board. In terms of academic promotion, the acknowledgement that an author is okay with making their work public, they're basically saying, okay, I may not have a whole lot of peer-reviewed published research, but I am in the process of publishing this, and I am confident enough in my preliminary results to show the public this and have people comment on it. So, so tenure committees can take that into account when they're looking at people who are looking for a promotion. So, in summary, preprints have a whole lot of benefits. Preprints also fall within the spectrum of open access, particularly in green open access. And we're going to go into why very briefly. So what is green open access? Let me tell you what open access is first. Open access is basically freely available research. And we've already established that preprints are public. Green open access specifically is research deposited in a repository or an online archive. So usually the versions of a manuscript that get put in one of these repositories or servers is either the preprint or the postprint. And the preprint, once again, is the version of an article that is before peer review and before submission to a journal. A postprint is the version of an article that is after peer review and after acceptance to a journal, and they're also called accepted manuscripts. This whole process, green open access, is also called self-archiving. So if you see that, it's essentially the same thing. Often these are placed under Creative Commons licenses, but not always. That example that I showed you at the very beginning from MetaArchive, that disclaimer also had a Creative Commons license on it. So you will see that in a lot of preprint servers. However, journals have different policies about whether they allow preprints to go on servers before you get published with them. And there is a really great database called Transpose that we're going to take a look at that shows different journal policies. So here we go to Transpose. As you can see, it is a database of journal policies on peer review, co-reviewing, and preprinting. So I am going to do a search for the New England Journal of Medicine. There it is. And we're going to take a look at their preprint policy. So the preprint policies are at the bottom. And we can see that the version of the paper allowed in a preprint server is none. So the New England Journal of Medicine is actually quite strict when it comes to posting work on preprint servers. They're basically saying, we consider this a prior publication. Do not do this. You cannot get published in our journal if your work is on a preprint server before you submit it to us. So that's a little bit of a downer. However, be encouraged by the fact that they're more and more in the minority. So a lot, and I would say even the majority of publishers and journals are okay with you putting your work on a preprint server. So let's just take a quick look at a different one. So I'm going to type in BMJ, which is a publisher and also has a journal. Once again, we're going to go down here, and here is their policy, and they are much more relaxed about it. They are okay with you putting a preprint on a preprint server. And in fact, they are okay with you licensing it under a Creative Commons license. So these are two, CC BY and CC BY NC are two different Creative Commons licenses. They're okay with that as long as you retain copyright of your own work. So that's a pretty nice policy. And after that, you can indeed submit to their, if you would like to publish with them, you can indeed submit that preprint to them. So please check journal policies before you decide to post a preprint, because a lot of places are fine with it, but some places, as we saw, are not. So where can we find them? There are a whole bunch of places. I'm only going to go into a small sample of the different locations you can find preprints in. The first category is, of course, preprint servers. I've already mentioned the top three here. There's bioRxiv, medRxiv, and arXiv. ASAP Bio is an organization that actually runs Transpose, the database we were just looking at, but they also have a preprint server. The Open Science Foundation has a preprint archive. And SSRN, which used to just be social science and law, so SSRN stands for Social Science Research Network, now has a medical research network platform called MedRN. So there are many, many others. These are just a sampling of some of the larger ones and the more prominent ones. There are also institutional and subject repositories. So both Open Door and OAD give you, these are directories of different repositories. So Open Door is a directory of global open access repositories, and OAD, which stands for the Open Access Directory, has a list of disciplinary specific repositories. And I'm also going to mention academic social networks, but with a caveat. So you've probably heard of either or both ResearchGate or academia.edu. However, they are not considered repositories by a lot of journals and publishers. And it's because they're not repositories, they're social networks. So please be careful, please check with the journal that you are particularly interested in publishing with before you post anything on one of these, because a lot of places will be okay with you posting on a repository or a server, but they won't be okay with you posting on a social network. So once again, check and see how your journal or publisher feels about that. And this is an exciting and brand new development. So I'm actually very happy that this session is coming out right now, because this was just announced on June 9th. The National Library of Medicine is launching a pilot project for preprints. It's called the NIH Preprint Pilot, because the research that they're looking at is NIH funded. The preprints are going to be available in PubMed Central, and the citations will be available in PubMed. The goal here is to increase discoverability of early NIH research results. And right now, for their pilot, which is going to go on for about 12 months, they're focusing on COVID-19 research. So once again, COVID-19 is a terrible thing, but it is showing the importance of why we need preprints, because it's really important to have this research available quickly. And the National Library of Medicine, the NIH, are aware of that, and this is why this pilot has come into existence. So there are going to be newly created filters. So you can see on the top here that there is a publication type for preprint now, and there are going to be other filters so that you can either exclude or include preprints in your search results. And you can also see there is this gigantic green banner that is going to appear for all preprints that show up on PubMed Central. So it will say very clearly, this article is a preprint, and preprints have not been peer-reviewed. So it'll be very exciting to see how this goes in the next year or so. So far, I've been very, very positive about preprints, but of course, there are concerns that we have to address. And I'll just stop for a second. Does anyone have any questions right now? There will be a question and answer session at the very end. So if you'd like to wait until then, that's fine. But if you have one now, feel free to ask.
Can I ask one question?
Sure.
So let's say we have an article which is submitted to the JAMA or any JM, and according to their policy, they do not allow preprints.
Mm-hmm.
But if one of the other journal rejects, then we can still put the same thing in the preprints after the rejection, right? And while they are already under the review, we cannot put it into any other.
Right. So while it's under review, you can't put anything.
Right. Okay.
Okay. Thank you very much for that question. So let's talk about two big concerns that people have when it comes to preprints. The first is scooping. And what is scooping, first of all? Scooping is when someone publishes something on a topic before another person or people do. So it's kind of, but it's kind of like pulling the rug out from under someone. And a lot of people are very concerned that if they post preprints, that other people are going to steal their ideas. However, this is less of a concern because, as I mentioned before, preprint servers assign DOIs and timestamps to ensure that scooping doesn't happen. So this is that establishment of priority that I mentioned before. It makes it clear who came first. And in addition, preprints can actually help in cases of unintentional scooping. So I'm going to give you an example. When two research teams are working on the same question and work from one research team appears as a preprint first. And this isn't malicious. This isn't, this isn't done with ill intentions. It's just that different research teams in similar fields sometimes converge on the same topic at the same time. It just happens. When we have preprints, so when that second research team decides to post their findings as a preprint, keeping in mind, of course, that they are citing the first already posted research team's work, if they do this within a few weeks, it's obvious that the work was formed independently, because you can't steal someone's idea and then create a whole new study and come out with the methods and the data and the analysis of that study within a month. It just is not possible. So when preprints are involved, once again, it's clear, it establishes that these two teams just happen to be working on the same thing at the same time. And one of them was a little bit faster than the other. When you're not working with preprints, it gets a little bit harder, because let's say, excuse me, let's say that second research team has decided to go straight to journal publication. They're not going to post a preprint. The journal might reject them because they'll say, well, there's this preprint already that establishes this priority. It's too similar. Or if the publication does go through, if it does go through this long process, there's a larger gap between the first and the second studies. So it becomes less clear what that second group did, what the achievements are, because there's a long gap between the first and second study coming out. So in this case, preprints can actually help in the case of scooping. In addition, more and more journals are putting out scoop protection policies. So Transpose, that database that we just went into very quickly, also has scoop protection policies listed if there are any. And it's not that common, but it's becoming more common. So basically what these policies do is that they assume that competing articles after a submission date are not considered relevant to the editorial assessment. So they're kind of ignoring the other work, because they're saying, okay, we understand that they're coming out around the same time, and that just happened. So you can take a look at scoop protection policies as well, in case you are worried about that. And the other major concern, of course, is information quality. I have mentioned several times at this point that preprints are not peer-reviewed. So the worry is that just because of that, information is going to be inferior, which is a valid concern, but that's also kind of assuming that just because something is peer-reviewed means it's flawless, and as we all know, that's not true. So this is not a problem that's unique to preprints. It's an issue that is publication-wide. There can be terrible information in peer-reviewed work as well. However, people are worried that poor quality information can be posted, or scientists can post data prematurely, and that goes back to that scooping fear, so that people are just going to post everything they have. They're going to throw it at the screen because they're so afraid of being scooped. There's also the worry that reporters who are looking for a juicy story, or people who are non-experts, including patients, don't know the difference between preprints and published articles. So they're going to look at an article, at a preprint that has inferior information, and they're going to run with it. And yes, these are valid concerns. However, there are mechanisms in place to make sure that this doesn't happen. So I am going to show you an example of a withdrawn paper from the COVID-19 server from medRxiv and bioRxiv. So the author feedback mechanism for preprints also comes in handy for information that's misleading or just of inferior quality. So people who are commenting can be really nice, they can be really constructive and say, this is a great paper. Or they can also say, this is awful. Everything about this is not reliable, is not valid, does not hold up. And in fact, that's what happened with this particular paper. So this is a paper that went up on a Friday on bioRxiv. It's about HIV and COVID-19. And it was torn apart because it was not valid. So by, I think, Monday, it was withdrawn. And as you can see, it says this article has been withdrawn. Click here for details. And if you go down to the PDF itself, every single page has withdrawn in very big letters. So the record remains so that people know about it. But it's clear that there was something very wrong with this. So author feedback is a big deal. And so this sort of sorts itself out quickly. bioRxiv, for example, also does not accept preprints that if posted could be damaging to human health. So it's not like you just, you decide to submit something to a preprint server and it goes up automatically. They do have screening involved. And of course, it's not as in-depth as if you were going through a whole publication process, but it does exist. And probably the biggest thing here is that reputation is really important to researchers and scientists. So if they are, with the fear that scientists are going to post data prematurely, if they keep doing that, they're going to destroy their careers because people are going to pick them apart. And reputation is really king. You have to have a good reputation to advance your career. In addition, so I mentioned arXiv, and I mostly mentioned it to show you that it's been around for almost 30 years. And if this was really a problem, we would have seen it in arXiv. And we have not seen it in arXiv at all. This has not been a problem. Scooping has not been a problem in arXiv. And although places like bioRxiv and medRxiv are much younger, they haven't been around as long as arXiv has been, we're not seeing those problems happen with them either. So while these are valid concerns, there are a lot of things built into the system to make sure that this doesn't happen. In addition, so people not knowing the difference between preprints and published articles, there are disclaimers everywhere. So I showed you the one for the NIH pilot. I mentioned the one on medRxiv at the very top. There are disclaimers everywhere saying, this is not peer-reviewed. This is not the final version of an article. This is a preprint. Keep that in mind. So the concerns are not as looming as they might seem otherwise. So the last thing I'm going to talk about is how to cite preprints, and also, can you cite preprints in your own research? The answer is usually yes. Once again, this is something you should check with a journal in particular about, but usually they're okay with it as long as you're acknowledging that part of your bibliography has preprints in it, and you're making it clear which ones are preprints. They're okay with that usually. Just as there are no standard definitions for preprints, there's no one way to cite preprints. However, the NIH, coming to the rescue again, has put out a memo where they have a template that they'd like people to use when they are submitting documents to them. So this is what that citation looks like. And as you can see, the biggest thing is that the word preprint is there. But there are other places that provide guidance as well. So bioRxiv has its own template for citing things that are on it. I would go with the NIH example because it seems like it is the most complete, but once again, check with the journal you want to publish with. So the last thing I'm going to mention is just the mini sessions that are coming up through mid-August. So if you are interested in any of those, please feel free to sign up. Thank you very much for joining me today, and I hope to see you in future sessions.